All right, so we have gotten through the first section in the morning, and we skipped over this module here, the WQMP template, primarily because we're going to come back to it in this module, and also because you will notice that there's not a lot of there's not a lot different with the template now than there has been in the past. But what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about the process of project WQMP preparation and review, and we'll continue to gloss over some of the details of the calculations, but we'll talk a little bit more about the order of operations, what comes when, and when you're going to have a chance to review, when you should have a chance to review, what a conceptual WQMP is compared to a final project WQMP, and maybe I don't know that there's a right and wrong way, and it's to each jurisdiction's discretion how they run those, but maybe some discussion about what folks are doing and what they've been seeing is working and so on. So we'll kind of talk through the WQMP template. We'll use that as the structure for talking about how someone goes about developing the information to develop a WQMP, and then talk about transitioning that then to a final WQMP submittal, and then the sort of phasing of the general phasing of project approval. And I want to clarify that anything you hear in here related to how you review conceptuals or finals and how you then orchestrate the things coming together for a project approval is something that's really your process as an implementing agency, and not something that the county is going to define for you. There are certain things, of course, that the permit requires about approval. For example, the WQMP actually needs to be, the things on the WQMP actually need to be built. And so how you assure that happens, and that they actually need to be maintained, so how you assure that happens. But the specific mechanism by which you make that happen is not necessarily specified in the permit. So the conceptual, what do folks here call it? You prefer conceptual or preliminary? Either or? Doesn't really matter. It means exactly the same thing as it's used in the documents. It's just that some folks use one, some folks use another. They don't mean anything different to me. This is used during the land development entitlement process as part of the application for discretionary approval typically. And it's the first thing that you are going to see on an official basis, although what we'll talk about is with the significant implications that some of these requirements have on site design, as Daniel mentioned, avoiding sources of sediment, as I've talked about, making sure you have enough room in your site for these type of BMPs. The earlier developers know about these requirements, the better. And so there's really no probably official way for you to reach out to them prior to the time when you see the conceptual WQMP, but if there is a way to have a pre-submittal meeting before they go too far down the road, I think it can save people a lot of grief. They can make it clear to their investors how much of their site they're going to be able to use. They can accurately reflect BMP footprints in their performa, and it can help save some of the significant heartache that can be felt when all of a sudden they realize they're losing units compared to what they've told their investors or just what they've reported on their performa. So. And this project or the conceptual WQMP doesn't need to describe exactly what is going to be built. It's not a construction level document. For a small project, it may contain the exact level of detail that you would see in a final WQMP. For a larger project, it may be a little bit more broad brush. It may define categories of the project, the different land use areas of the project, and it may define the BMPs that will be implemented. It may define the more detailed analyses that will be done to demonstrate that the project complies with the MEP standard. So this is going to be your first opportunity to review. This is also going to be your opportunity to offer guidance towards what they're going to need to do, either in terms of changing the commitments that they're talking about making. So there could be an opportunity here for you to say, that commitment that you're making to use treatment control BMPs for this area doesn't fly. You need to do LID BMPs everywhere. You need to commit to evaluating feasibility and do that. It might also just be an opportunity for you to condition things. So maybe they've presented a level of detail that's conceptual, preliminary in nature. They've made the right commitments, but you want to make sure as part of your approval process that as plans progress that they're actually going to divide this thing up into drainage management areas. They're going to identify the DCV for each drainage management area, and they're going to show that's done. Maybe that's the kind of detail that doesn't need to necessarily show up on a conceptual WQMP for some types of projects, but you want to make sure that they will end up doing that as part of their full project WQMP. So this is your opportunity to put conditions on the project, to offer suggestions for how they change. This is typically in support of either a CEQA process for a significant project or some other form of discretionary planning approval. So the general template of a WQMP, you should probably see things generally in this form. You have the opportunity to adapt the template that the county prepares to what suits you, but just to be compatible with the model WQMP and the guidance document, keeping these section numbers probably makes a lot of sense for folks to not get lost when developers move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and so on. And so what we have to start off with is the project owner certification. So this is it's stating what specifically the legal definition of the project is, who the owner is, and their signature stating that they accept responsibility for this WQMP. And so you'll have specific information that needs to be included just as a standardized metric. You're also going to have a section for any conditions that have been imposed as part of prior planning actions. So if this is part of a tract map that's historic, doesn't have any sort of grandfathering, but there's certain conditions that are imposed as part of prior. More often you're going to see water quality conditions come in after a conceptual WQMP has been reviewed or after an EIR has been certified and certain water quality mitigation measures have been identified. And so this is where those conditions apply in addition to what's found in the model WQMP. And so you would put those here. They would put these here to set the stage. We're going to show how we meet the model water quality management plan criteria. We're also going to show how we meet these specific water quality conditions. You'd also look for them if this is being done as part of a watershed-based plan, and in this area at this point in time, that's really would be a TMDL implementation plan. There may be other additional conditions that would apply to certain types of projects. So the project description, and this is not looking for you to break the project down in terms of A through Z drainage management area. This is not where we describe the project in that level of detail. This is where someone describes the general overall nature of the project in adequate detail to define specifically what the project is, the bounds within which it'll work, the type of land uses it proposes, the acreages of those land uses. And the purpose here is to make sure that the project description doesn't change significantly from what they've gotten approved as part of discretionary approval and what ends up ultimately coming in for final approval. That's one purpose of this. The project description can't significantly change relative to water quality characteristics of runoff and expect the same approval of a conceptual WQMP to carry through to grandfathering of their final WQMP. If things do change, that would be reopening and the need to define additional source control BMPs or result in different selection of BMPs to address the pollutants of concern. So one of the other things that shows up in this section is the identification of pollutants of concern. And I will point out, as I pointed out earlier, that we have a hierarchy that we're working in, and pollutants of concern really only show up after we've hit the treatment control element of the hierarchy, which is really bad territory for a project to be in any case, because they're going to have to do some offsite mitigation in addition to the treatment control. So this is a legacy, and it's important for folks to understand what pollutants are generated from their site and for the WQMP to reflect that, but the practical implication of what these pollutants are on BMP selection is less important now. So the site description is really, I think, a place where we're going to need to see a lot more detail, and we're going to need to talk and have a discussion with project applicants about what type of detail they're including here. Because the site characteristics essentially set the stage for what feasibility determinations they're going to be using to document why they're picking certain BMPs. And so these tables provide a basis for a simple summary of each in a standardized template, but if all you see are these tables, then something's wrong. You know, somebody is not doing their job, and we need to see more information about each of these categories in narrative below these headers, and particularly where we have someone in later section talking about infeasibility of infiltration on the basis of geotechnical conditions that exist. There needs to be an elaboration on what those geotechnical conditions are, what investigation has been done to clarify that those exist, and most likely what we're going to need to see is something attached to the document, a geotechnical report of some basis that's been approved, that's been prepared by a professional, and provides a technically defensible basis for this for that determination. That's just one example, but we're going to need to look for more in this. In the watershed description, we're going to need to look for a description of the receiving waters from the project, and a characterization of whether they're susceptible or not. If some of the exemptions that Daniel has mentioned come through, you know, we may need to be getting into an area of defining exactly what exemption someone has taken and providing the technical defense for why that exemption applies to the project. That could take a number of forms, but the takeaway here is that these subheadings are useful to kind of check the box and make sure people have hit the key items. There's additional discussion about what specifically folks need to be looking for that's provided in the technical guidance document. And ultimately what we need to be looking for is a site characterization and watershed description that supports the decisions that are made later on with the level of rigor that's necessary. So the best management practices section, as someone gets into this, they may have a whole bunch of different approaches for how they develop BMP designs. As you've heard, we have two overlapping performance standards. We have an LID performance standard. We have a hydromodification performance standard. Some of the flowcharts will kind of make it seem like it's a linear process, that you do LID BMPs first, and then if you don't have enough to achieve hydromod, you go to hydromod. In reality, if you know hydromod applies, and you know that you're probably going to be 2 to 4 times larger on hydromod, then I would start with hydromod, and they're probably going to start with hydromod as their controlling aspect of BMP sizing and site design, and then they're going to come back and they're going to check to make sure that the LID criteria are met via the hydromod design that they've provided. And so this section could take a whole number of forms, depending on which conditions apply, which criteria apply to the project, what soil types are, and which type of sizing standard controls the overall design of the project. This could take a number of forms, but what the key things that you need to look for in this is that they've adequately defined what their project performance criteria are. So this is a summation of what they've went through up above. They've identified their water quality conditions of approval. They've identified if they're part of a TMDL implementation plan. They've identified if they have hydromod criteria that apply, LID criteria. This is where they're going to summarize that for you so that you can clearly check that and say they know what their project performance criteria are. They know what applies. The next things that you're going to see may be a little bit more free form, depending on what conditions apply. But you should see a description of how the site plan has been laid out and the drainage plan has been laid out to accommodate BMPs. So you should see them attempting to develop a site design that allows for BMPs to be incorporated. Because this is going to be a critical part of you being able to accept, you've done what you can, I can allow you to go to an alternative program, as opposed to you came to me with a 1990s site design and you telling me that LID is not feasible, but I can't buy that. I need you to start early. And this is really where we get into the importance of early discussions with and outreach to the development community about what requirements apply, and essentially that they're going to have to think about this earlier. LID BMP selection and conformance and hydromod BMP selection and conformance, this is where they're going to tell you these are the feasibility criteria that applied. This is why I picked this BMP. This is the BMP design, and this is why it conforms with the LID criteria. So let's take the example of someone who's designed a BMP for hydromod control. It's it's sized to 4 acre-feet. They show that on their plans. They could even, and Remy will show us that the model will spit out a amount of water that's infiltrated as a result of that overall design. This is the amount of water that's infiltrated. That's what the HMP model predicts. Their conformance for LID may be just saying, look, HMP controlled this design. The resulting design infiltrates the amount of water that exceeds the LID DCV. Therefore, that's compliance. We don't need to go through all the LID BMP worksheets that to do LID BMP sizing. We've already have a sizing standard that controls. The same BMP also meets LID criteria. So that's an example of how that might look. On the other hand, if hydromod doesn't control, someone could simply do some sizing worksheets, identify the LID BMP that they've picked and why it meets why it's right for the site given the feasibility conditions, and demonstrate that the size that they've provided is greater than or equal to the size that's required for the LID requirements. So this section is going to be a bit freeform, and I think the key is just that they need to provide enough information here so that they show that they conform and that you can check the box and make that approval. This section is also going to describe the source control BMPs that they're using, and if they do get into a waiver and alternative compliance plan, they're also going to describe that plan here. So that plan is going to be BMP based, and so it won't be LID BMPs and hydromod BMPs. It's going to be the BMPs that are included as part of the alternative compliance plan. But it's also BMP based, and it will also be described in this section. So then section 5 or section 6 is where you notice I've skipped over section 5 because that's the O&M plan. That's not necessarily required as part of a conceptual preliminary WQMP. It needs to be included as part of a final. I've skipped over that for now. Section 6 is essentially a map, and the best practices for this map is generally to show it over the same base as the project site plans, so that you can assure that everything's to scale. You can do area takeoffs as needed to make sure that they've sized things accordingly and so on. It has a number of things that it needs to show. I will note that this map could become more detailed and more refined as you move from a conceptual to a final WQMP. The conceptual plan, it might be able to just call out an overall drainage management area and define the amount of DCV that drainage management area will eventually provide in a number of systems. But then at the final project plan, that drainage management area will need to be diced up into the tributary area to each of these systems, and the specific sizing calculations will need to be provided for each of those systems. So that now as we move from a conceptual to a project WQMP, and this is where folks are going to differ. Talking last week with folks, some of them say for a small project they require the exact level of detail to be included in their conceptual as they accept in their final, with the intent that if everything goes through discretionary approval without changes, they can just change the cover sheet. This becomes a final. And I think that makes a lot of sense for a very small project, where at the conceptual level you want to have assurance that they've thought this through and they've identified the footprints that work, and you want to avoid the extra burden of having two separate submittals with different levels of detail. Now, from experience working on larger master planned type of projects that might occur in phases, might have overall chunks of land use that they want to have flexibility to revise as plans progress, they're going to come in with a much fuzzier conceptual. They're going to come in with a conceptual that looks a little bit more like blotches of color on a map and bulk commitments to do feasibility in this area and analysis in this area and the overall DCV that will be met in that area. And that's not a problem. It's just that their progression from conceptual to final is going to be much more significant. They're going to have to then, at the final, maintain the consistency with the overall project description that was described in the conceptual, include the conditions of approval, and then add a lot of final details that wouldn't have been covered in their conceptual submittal. At this point in time, we're also going to be looking for them to include the O&M requirements and responsibilities that will carry with the project and carry with the property. And so this one will, it may reflect a major increase in detail. It may reflect just a resubmittal with a different cover sheet with maybe a couple of revisions made, depending on the type of project and how far they've gone in the conceptual. So what you'll find is a kind of a template table for someone to add that BMP inspection and maintenance responsibilities and the triggers for doing corrective maintenance and so on. You'll also, at this point, be adding the educational materials. And something important to point out is that the county doesn't, the county is not requiring folks to actually attach copies of all these educational materials. They're hosting each of these on their website and at ocwatersheds.com. So a simple checkbox and a link to the educational materials that are relevant is adequate. We don't need to be padding a document full of a 5-inch binder. And so for project approval, the real key thing, everybody's going to do this a little bit differently, but the key thing is that the plans, the grading plans that you approve and that other departments may have authority to approve need to reflect what's shown on the WQMP. And the WQMP needs to reflect what's shown on the drainage plans. So this is a synchronization effort. Some folks would prefer to get their WQMP approve that before they will allow folks to submit the final grading plans for approval. Others, I've heard, will accept both at the same time and will essentially check the WQMP. If it looks good, they'll approve that internally, and then they'll go to the grading plans and say, are they actually providing those 2,000 cubic feet of storage in this drainage management area like they said they would in their WQMP. And I don't think these necessarily need to be really parallel processes. A lot of times what folks are asking for is that as part of the grading sheets, they have a WQMP map that's over the exact same base that's simply adding additional detail about the BMPs themselves, but on the same exact base grading. So I think I'm going to be able to, and I think the most important thing is that the WQMP is approved prior to the issuance of any sort of grading and building permits, and that those grading plans reflect what's required on the WQMP. And finally, that we are providing a mechanism by which that WQMP lives with the site and transfers with the ownership of the site. And that's, again, left to each jurisdiction to define their process. But most of what we've been hearing is that some sort of a recording at the county level is necessary so that the WQMP comes up in a title search. I mean, manufacturers are going to invest, my experience is manufacturers are going to invest in providing some design tools for engineers so that it makes it easy for them to comply. But manufacturers don't always realize when permits change and when requirements change, and so they may still be thinking that their system complies, but it's based on a previous permit or another permit in Southern California that they think it just applies across the whole area. So I never trust manufacturers to tell me exactly what I need to do to comply. Absolutely, you need to check the sizing calculations. I mean, as part of their package, what they should be pulling out for you, and what you should ask them to pull out for you, are the key design parameters that are interesting to you, which is the volume of the system, how much storage volume does it provide, cubic feet, acre feet, and then the geotech. And for example, if we were working with an infiltration system, you would also need to ask them for, well, what is the infiltration rate of this system? What have you done to substantiate that? How are you adjusting that rate for a factor of safety to account for the fact that this system will clog over time? And do all these things come together to result in a system that actually retains the design capture volume and drains it in 48 hours? And we'll get into the sizing calculations this afternoon. But you don't need to necessarily know the structural capacity. You don't need to know there's a lot of things about in that submittal that you don't need to know, but there are a few things that you need to be very confident of, that they've provided the design capture volume, that they're draining it in the right amount of time, and as a result, they're meeting the sizing requirements. Now, if the HMP applied, you would also need to see that this system has been accurately modeled in the SOCM model, and that they've designed their outlet structure consistent with what the recommendations of the SOCM model provides. So, yeah, I mean, I think that especially with, like, say, underground manufacturers, they're going to provide a big packet of specs that defines how the system's going to be procured and built. But by and large, they're not going to be doing the hydrologic. The manufacturer's not going to be doing the hydrologic sizing, and so that's something that the WQMP should call out and say.
Yeah, you are correct. They're showing that this 1 cubic and this is the sizing, and the engine doing the cuts. Okay, I cannot verify that if the manufacturer data are correct. What is also to
so like they're saying that they're saying that each cube is 10 cubic feet of storage. Yeah, I mean, if it's a reputable manufacturer, I have a feeling that that's a very short business model if they're selling something as 10 cubic feet and it's actually only 5. That's a very short-sighted business model. So by and large, if I'm talking with a vendor and they say, I have this pipe, and for every linear foot of this arch section, you can have 15 cubic feet of storage, I'm going to trust them. You know, they don't have. You can do the calculation. You can do some quick cross checks, but I mean that sort of thing. I have no trouble relying on the vendor to tell me. But of course, the actual sizing for the site, that's something the engineer needs to be doing.
Signing and stamping.
Yeah.
And basically, the source report part of the WQMP, and every grading plan we require that the source engineer also sign, not just the civil.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's a good practice. I think that's something that's nicely transferable. Is that they've signed the grading plan, and to certify that the sizing that they've required in the WQMP is actually being provided. Yeah, I like that. If it is 2 different people, that makes a lot of sense. Any other experiences from the battle, from the front lines of this process? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I should probably add that as a specific call out in the sense that you probably didn't have to deal with planting plans too much, or they weren't maybe as important, but a planting plan needs to be consistent from the WQMP to the landscape sheets and the grading sheets. One other lesson learned, and we've dealt with this in North Orange County, and I also see it in a lot of other cities that have gone further in LID, is that people are not doing a very good job with inlets and outlets from these systems. And they're inherently landscape-based, they're integrated within the site, and the result is that they don't have big drop inlets that civil engineers are used to designing. They have little curb cuts. They have maybe some riprap that brings the water from the curb line down to the bottom of the system, and so a couple of inches here and there can really influence the whether water gets into the system or not. And what we see is that the ultimate landscape protocol can sometimes result in folks replacing rocks, building the rock up at the inlet to the point where now water hydraulically prefers to go down the curb and bypass the system. And so being pretty careful in reviewing the inlet-outlet elevations and calcs, and making sure the construction plans are really clear that this is an inlet and that this is where the water is supposed to go, so that when it gets constructed, it's constructed with that purpose in mind. It's surprising how much erosion and scour you can create on an embankment when your preferential pathway, the pathway that's armored and supposed to be preferential, actually serves as a blockage, and so water goes around it on both sides and will scour on both sides and leave that pathway high and dry. I actually have a couple. I might as well show some pictures. As long as we're talking about this. This is a perfect example of a BMP that's matured over time. And with the maturation of the BMP, we've had multiple rounds of landscaping and beauty bark additions. And so these beautiful curb cuts here that are supposed to convey water in along the length of this infiltration bioretention area now have resulted in a significant mound such that water flows down the curb line on both sides and enters the system right here, right next to the inlet. So this is, it breaks my heart when I see something like this, because it's a great system and it's doing practically nothing. This is an example of one that's done well. You see that it's creating a nice pathway for water to get into the system. On the other hand, this one, you see the preferential flow pathways in this one are along here and along here, because this rock was mounted about 1 inch too high, 2 inches too high. This is an example of what we need to be concerned about in inlets also, is making sure we have actually enough hydraulic drop to get water in. This is an example of just a little leaf debris built up, and you have water flowing in the curb line and you have no water in the BMP, which also makes me really sad. This is another example of a better inlet that eats pizza boxes for lunch, and has also been known to be parked in, because it's right next to a parking space, and it's there's been some wheel tracks in here from folks not realizing it, they can't park there. Anyway, so some of the issues that come up with inlet outlet designs, and the importance of checking fine grades. All right, one more session and then we'll break for lunch. This one can be pretty short because it's primarily just taking the process for private projects and saying, well, how do we adapt this for public projects? And so maybe I should just open this up for a discussion of what's different between your approval process for private projects and public projects? Well, we're just gonna talk a little bit more about some of these categories of projects and what we're doing. This is a bit of a reiteration. For priority projects that happen to be public, things like recreational facilities, public buildings, public parking lots, that sort of thing, the same criteria apply as a private project, but I think the process would tend to be simpler. You don't need to go through maybe as many reviews. The approval processes may be different. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the WQMP needs to demonstrate that it meets the criteria, and it needs to match what's shown on the site plans. And I think that's the most important thing. Streets, roads, and freeways, at least in the next couple years, these are going to be addressed the same as a private project. And after the enrollment in the 2013 permit, redevelopment projects within an existing public right-of-way will be able to follow a Green Streets guidance. That will not apply to new roadway projects, but it will apply to redevelopment projects within the right-of-way, which probably relates to almost all of them that a city would do. The above-ground linear drainage projects, line channels, these can follow EPA Green Streets guidance. So the same template can be used. You probably have some different source control measures perhaps that would apply, the municipal maintenance procedures that the DAMP includes, which I'll get to. But in general, the same template. The rules are so similar, and the differences are so minor that we didn't think it was necessary to necessarily create one template and then another. At the local level, if you'd like to adapt the template to include both a public project template and a private project template, that's entirely up to you. That's totally fine. So for anybody who is working on above ground linear line drainage projects that could follow the EPA guidance, what you'll find is that this guidance is really opportunistic and identifies a lot of potential criteria that could make it more challenging to achieve the full design capture volume in these environments, and really guided by the MEP standard to do what you can, maybe provide some offsets by addressing adjacent area near the channel, but the BMPs don't need to meet the DCV standard, and alternative compliance doesn't apply if they can't meet it. And we provide more guidance on the Green Street approach in Section 2.7 of the TGD. So below ground linear drainage and utility projects, these could result in replacing more than 5,000 square feet of impervious surface within an existing right-of-way. So if it maintains original line and grade, hydraulic capacity, original purpose of and what we've really realized is that the original purpose of the facility doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you're digging up a trench and you're putting in dry utilities. The original purpose of that facility was ground, and now it's utilities. But the key thing that triggers all of our water quality management plan requirements is what occurs at the surface. And so the original purpose of the surface of the facility being the road itself, or occurs in response to an emergency. If you are altering the line and grade or upsizing the hydraulic capacity of the storm drain, then it would be a priority project. Why don't you define emergency?
How does the board view
Well, interestingly enough, this language that these exclusions essentially are not even in the San Diego permit. They're something that has been added to the model WQMP to reflect, that there needs to be some floor below which we're not going to apply priority project designation. And the board, in their substantial conformance or conditional finding of adequacy that they issued in June, did not comment on that, and so we've been able to keep it. So how the San Diego board views emergency, I don't know. I have no idea. The document goes on to say that that a notice should be provided to the, something should be put on file about the construction project within, I think, a week after the emergency repair has occurred. So that, I think that kind of implies that this is a really short term, like this needed to get fixed over the weekend, and then we backfilled with the documentation. But I don't know. There's no definition provided necessarily. As I mentioned, a master WQMP is recognized in the model WQMP as being something that would identify all the projects that a municipality may intend to construct of a certain type, over a certain planning window, and could identify a programmatic level approach for compliance with those type of projects. It wouldn't relax the standards, but it could potentially argue for why they need to be more flexibly implemented, involving some of the alternative compliance options that the permit and the model WQMP allow. And then you'll find in DAMP Section 5, which you're probably already familiar with, is a list of the municipal non-structural source control measures, which can be used as documentation to include in WQMPs for public projects as a form of source controls and operational parameters. So everyone's going to do, I think this is where it probably becomes even more simple. You're not working with an external party to have them submit, you review. By and large, you're able to maybe streamline this process of confirming that the BMPs meet the WQMP requirements and confirming that what's on the plans matches the WQMP. So. Is there anything I missed in this? Any key things that come up on public projects that you typically struggle with that may struggle more with these new LID standards? I guess it depends on what the eventual use is. I definitely think a park would be. A park's rarely going to have zero impervious cover, but I mean a park, especially if you're going to allow dogs and if you're going to allow some sort of an active landscaping regime to occur at the park, then that would be constituting a priority project if it was over an acre, even if it didn't exceed the impervious area thresholds. A landslide remediation, I think that's a little bit more subjective. This came up last week also. Typically, they're not going to remediate it just to a natural state. If they do, then it's pretty clear that it's not a priority project. You would need to seek the construction permits in order to do the grading, and you would seek enrollment underneath the industrial or the construction general permit likely. But if the post-construction surface is restored back to native or a native drought-tolerant vegetation, then that's not going to constitute an increase in pollutant loading. That's probably as far as I'll take it. I think there may be some minor incidental addition of impervious surface that wouldn't necessarily trigger the threshold. So we need to think about the long-term condition, because these requirements all apply to all post-construction controls, and so certain projects certainly will elevate the potential pollutant loading during the construction phase or the immediate establishment period after the construction phase, but after those construction permits are closed, does the ultimate long-term condition of the site increase runoff volumes or pollutant loads? That's the question. Does it trigger one of these criteria?